Ignatius of Loyola, on the third day of the second week, would have us meditate on two scenes: the obedience of Jesus to his parents during his childhood, and the finding in the temple when he was 12 years old. These two scenes wrap up for St. Ignatius the, quote, hidden life of Christ. And then on the fourth day of the second week, we have the famous meditation on the two standards. So recall, these talks are not meant to be theological reflections necessarily. They might have some theological insights, but ultimately it's meant to help your prayer. It's a talk on prayer. What the insights of Christ's life and the mysteries of God, such as sin and hell, what they do is they show us the heart of God. They show us about the heart of God. They show us about our own heart as well, what's going on inside of us. And ultimately, the talks lead to a fusion of our hearts. So in this hidden life of Christ meditation, I'm going to jam 30 years worth, I guess, into 20 minutes. So good luck here with me. People sometimes are frustrated with the hidden life. We want to know more about what Jesus did during these 30 years, don't we? Who he was. What did he say? Like when we hear he was talking to those priests and rabbis in the temple when he was 12 years old, asking them questions, boy, we would give anything to just know one question that Jesus would have asked. One question. Could you imagine? Or what did he talk with Joseph about, his father, Mary, during all those years? We don't know anything. The Gospels say so little. All we have is the laconic line, Jesus went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them, and his mother kept all these things in her heart, and Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. That's Luke chapter 2, 51 to 52. That's all we know. And it frustrates us, but in a way, this is the mystery. The reality that Jesus lived for 30 years, 90% of his life, and we do not know exactly what he did or said, is the mystery, is the message. The incarnate God was not always doing something, or doing something in our eyes relevant. Of course, Jesus was doing things during those 30 years, but in terms of the mission, I guess you could say they were not relevant. They were ordinary things. He was working, he was eating, sleeping, recreating, studying, and so forth. The things that we do. No miracles, no profound teachings, no sacrifice. And again, we don't think they're relevant, but they are. For Christ came to redeem not just generic mankind, but he came to redeem you and me specifically. He came to redeem you. You sitting out there. Me. And what do you do? What do I do? Very ordinary things, those things that Jesus did. We have hidden lives. We work, we sleep, we eat, we recreate. We have our hobbies. Christ, as the theologians say, sanctified the ordinary in the hidden life. However, if you're impatient like I am, and you're a millennial, and you're always looking to be achieving, not that other generations don't try to achieve, but I guess that's a characteristic of millennials, you have an abhorrence of wasting time. You don't like to do things that aren't producing or effective. And so for you, the hidden life would be a struggle like it is for me. Think of the last time you were swept up into something that was futile, something that you were wasting time, sitting in line somewhere, not going anywhere, wasting time on a computer, some technological malfunction. Heard the seminarians yelling at their computers today about something. Microsoft Word deleting your hard work and you having to start over again, cleaning the kitchen only to have your child come in a few minutes later and dirty it up. Think of something where it was just a total waste of time. Christ had the same experience. He underwent the same thing. And so you wasting time actually fundamentally isn't a waste of time. There's something very beautiful, an act of surrender in that. So for me, as I was praying these meditations on the 30-day retreat, Christ as a toddler, as a teenager, then as a man in his 20s, I found myself growing a little restless. So again, 30 years of Christ. So again, Christ was in his 20s when he was still doing nothing. There are 20-year-olds who are millionaires currently, right? Christ did nothing in his 20s in our minds. I found myself saying, okay, Lord, this is a nice little exercise, but let's get to the real stuff. Let's get to the baptism. Let's get to the miracles. Let's get to the Sermon on the Mount. Enough of this hidden life of Christ, right? But this is the work of the Spirit leading me to rest. For Jesus, these 30 years, he was resting from his main work of redemption. It was a message to me, and maybe to you if this is resonating, that we don't always have to be accomplishing something concrete to do God's will. Again, like I said, as a millennial, but again, maybe you find yourself in this category too. Always need to be doing something, always need to be moving on to the next thing, accomplishing, achieving, always be closing, ABC, right? This is a wound in the millennial generation, a wound in me. And Jesus, who would have been a millennial at that time, 2,000 years ago in his 20s, believed he entered this wound and he healed it. Every generation has its wound, has its shortcoming. Christ experienced all these generations. So whatever your generational wound is or your particular wound, Jesus is in that. I'll give you another example of my inability to just do something mundane. I've never been inclined to cook. Okay? I've never been inclined to cook. You probably know this about me. I find cooking, to me, it's a struggle because I could be doing something else. I just want to eat food and then move on. Eat good food, obviously, but then move on, right? The time spent preparing the meal, I could be answering email, I could be working on my homily, I could be doing some spiritual reading, I could even be praying in the chapel. So to me, cooking is difficult. But in the last week, I noticed, actually there was a couple meals that I helped prepare. The seminarians have been cooking too, behind me here. In the preparation, there weren't elaborate meals by any stretch of the imaginations, and the seminarians didn't die eating it. But in the preparation of the meal, though, I was able to notice something spiritual occurring in this mundane act of preparing food. Now, I know for some of you enjoy preparing food, and that's a gift, so don't let me belittle that act. I know it can be very profound, and some people make a profession out of it. But for me, so maybe you have your own thing. Maybe watching a Bears game for you is very mundane and a waste of time, right? So use that as an example. But in the preparing of food, there's a death to self. So yes, I'd rather be answering email or reading or working on my homily, but I'm dying to myself, and I'm saying, in this mundane act that I don't think is doing anything really worthwhile, I'm trusting that God is inviting me to be and encounter him right now. And there is actually something good, because I'm not only dying to myself, but I'm doing something good for others, right? Preparing food for other people. So there's a union of my soul going on with God beneath the surface of that mundane activity. Author Kathleen Norris, she has a little book called Quotidian Mysteries. And I can appreciate now more and more how God is encountered and how a union with God has occurred in cooking and cleaning and commuting to work. These things are entry points of prayer. Now, don't get me wrong, please keep dropping meals off. I'm not going to become a cook, but man cannot live on chili and Italian beef alone. That's pretty much the extent of my cooking. So, again, Jesus doing nothing in these 30 years but working and cooking and cleaning type stuff. It invites us into surrender. praying with this. And there's a reason the church has rejected the apocryphal gospels, those stories that invented miracles in Christ's early life. There's what's called the infancy gospel of Thomas. This is an apocryphal gospel. This isn't in the canonical list. It made stuff up about like how Jesus, a boy, like made a pigeon out of mud, as a miracle, or some kid was bullying him and he struck him down, or he shamed his rabbis, right? Like we're itching for miracles. We look for things. We want Jesus to get on with the mission, but the church has rejected that. Said no. There's something in God's wisdom to surrender and to do nothing. We surrender our need to accomplish or achieve something on a grand level. We trust in that Latin axiom, age quod agis, do what you are doing. Do what you are doing. We have to trust that that is a prayer. There is a beauty in simply being. The French poet Charles Péguy wrote, "They have the courage to work. They don't have the courage to do nothing. They possess the virtue of work. They don't possess the virtue of doing nothing." End quote. Do you have the courage to do nothing? Do you have the virtue to do nothing? If you struggle to accept that, if you find yourself squirming in the hidden life, now you have your point of prayer. You can ask God, why do I need to accomplish? What is this urge in me? Or what is this drive that I need to be doing stuff all the time? Is it, again, some insecurity or some warped image of God that he'll only love you if you're doing something? Allow God to take you to that place in your heart, that vulnerable place. Because when you're asking those questions and you're praying, what you're doing is you're destroying your false self. St. Laura Montaya Epigui wrote, quote, "Destroy me, O Lord. Destroy me, O Lord, and upon my ruins build a monument to your glory." Destroy me, O Lord, and upon my ruins build a monument to your glory. St. Laura, who said that quote, she founded the Missionary Sisters of Mary Immaculate and St. Catherine of Siena in the jungles of Colombia, actually. She was the first canonized saint of Colombia, 19th century. She grew up in extreme poverty. When her father died, she was young. She was forced to become a school teacher to help provide for her siblings. But she felt the call to the religious life, so she became a nun, but she also felt called to bring the gospel to the natives in the jungles of Colombia. And so what she did, she spent the rest of her life living with these primitive people in the jungles, doing very mundane activities, right? Building huts and fetching water, building fires, cooking. But she called this, quote, her pedagogy of love. Her pedagogy of love. It was a method, very mundane method. Many saints have lived this way. And this shaped the hearts of the people she lived with and encountered. This is how she really evangelized these native people. She didn't do advanced administrative work. She didn't write sophisticated books on theology to advance the deposit of faith. She didn't make reforms to the future church. She did nothing like that. Like I said, very mundane. And when she taught, it was very elementary catechesis. And she even grew sick at the end of her life and spent the last 9 years of her life in a wheelchair. And she's a canonized saint. She lived that hidden life in the jungles. She said, quote, "There's a need for intrepid women, valiant and on fire with the love of God, who would be able to unite their lives with those of the poor inhabitants of the jungle to lift them toward God." End quote. There's a need for intrepid women, intrepid men, yes. And sometimes to be intrepid means just to live simply with our current situation, with all its ordinariness, even its dreariness. There's a death to our self-glory in this, but like St. Laura said, on our ruins, God will build his glorious monument. A glorious monument like the Jerusalem temple, like that place that Jesus retreated to when he was lost. The Jerusalem temple was such an iconic feature in Jesus' life, in the life of any ancient Jew. You can never escape, regardless of where you were living in the Holy Land, you can never escape the shade or the shadow of the temple. It's like living in Chicago, and the Sears Tower, the Willis Tower, is just like an iconic part of your life. If you're a Cubs fan, Wrigley Field, a place you went to as a kid and you go to every summer of your life, or your parish church. Right? It's just a building that's part of your DNA. Jesus says, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" He said that to his parents when they found him in the temple. Yes, the Jerusalem temple was really Jesus' house. It was a building with which he was very familiar, where he was comfortable. He couldn't escape from it, even if he wanted to, but he didn't. He was drawn to the Jerusalem temple. And so when he's lost, it's natural for him to go there. I got lost as a kid at the Taste of Chicago in Grant Park. It wasn't a fun experience getting lost. And I was a little younger than Jesus was. But the way Christ was drawn to the temple, I was drawn to the Billy Goat cheeseburger stand and Dicka's fried ice cream booth. But Christ was led to this place of comfort, which was that temple, where several centuries earlier, a similar boy likewise was at peace. And that was Samuel. You know the story of Samuel. There's a parallel between Jesus being lost and the young boy Samuel. Samuel's asleep, and he's sleeping on the temple floor, and he hears the voice of God, but he doesn't recognize it right away. So he has to ask the priest Eli what's going on. And Eli tells him what to do. And then there's a line that says both Samuel and then Jesus later, they grew in favor before God and men after this encounter of God in the temple. Now, Samuel didn't recognize right away God's voice, but Jesus did. Jesus was very familiar with the voice of God. And so he was able to explain the voice of God to the other priests and rabbis who he encountered in the temple. And Samuel, that little boy who slept at night on the temple floor, Jesus probably did the same thing. Remember, his parents found Jesus in the temple on the third day after being lost. Third day is kind of significant, as you know. So 3 days, Jesus was sleeping in the temple. He was spending all day there. At some point, the rabbis and the priests and the Pharisees must have noticed this boy that wasn't going home. That was sleeping there. It was early in the morning. There all afternoon, there evening. And when they probably asked him, what are you doing here? They struck up this conversation. And we hear that questions were exchanged both between Jesus and the rabbis. And again, this is where Jesus would have asked them questions, and the rabbi or the way of teaching often was asking questions, and Jesus would have given brilliant answers to their questions as a way to try to teach them. So again, you can imagine how profound that would have been. So imagine that 12-year-old boy, very comfortable in the temple sanctuary, escaping early in the morning on the last day of Passover. He thought he could get one more half hour of prayer when the porticos were empty and the money changers hadn't come out yet. The temple wasn't noisy. Jesus just wanted to spend one last time before his family returned to Nazareth. And he probably got swept up in prayer. Have you ever been swept up in prayer in an ecstasy where you lose track of time? And that's probably what could have happened. Jesus praying, he loses track of time. When he comes to, maybe it's that afternoon, his family's already departed. They've left to return to Nazareth. Now he's quick-witted. He knows not to go search for his family, because if he were to leave the walls of Jerusalem and try to find them in the desert, that would have been bad news. He probably would have gotten lost. He probably would have gotten kidnapped, maybe even killed. And so, smart that he is, what he does is he stays in Jerusalem, and he stays in the place where he knows his parents are going to find him, in the temple. It's like my parents knew to find me at the Billy Goat Cheeseburger Tavern, right? Because I was a chunky kid. So Jesus knew, he stayed where he was going to be found, but also where he wanted to be. And perhaps when Jesus is having this dialogue with the rabbis, he talked about the temple and how the temple one day would be destroyed. Something that he would say later on in life. Remember Matthew 24:2? Do you see all these things? Jesus said to the people in the temple. Truly I tell you, Not one stone here will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down. Maybe Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple when he was a 12-year-old or 14-year-old. Maybe Jesus talked about the real essence of the temple, the real Holy of Holies. Not that space, but the place in the heart. You know, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees at the dinner at Matthew's house, he said, "Go and learn the meaning of the words, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice.'" Go and learn the meaning of the words, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." That's Matthew 9:13. I wonder if Jesus said the same thing as a boy to those Pharisees. God doesn't desire the sacrifice of goats and bulls. He doesn't drink the blood of those offerings. He desires your heart. He desires mercy. Isaiah 26:20. "Go, my people, enter your chambers and close your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a brief moment till the wrath is past." Maybe Jesus told the Pharisees what Isaiah said. Go, enter your chambers, the chambers of your heart. That's your real temple. So Jesus, as we know, was found by his parents. They would return home. Jesus would return to Jerusalem year after year for the Passover. We don't know, as a late teenager, as a young adult in his 20s, if he had similar conversations with those priests, rabbis, and Pharisees. But he would have continued to go back to the temple, and he would have continued to see the temple being used, or rather abused. Not so much the selling and the extorting from the money changers, though that, of course, was an abuse that he would later cleanse, but rather the abuse that people were going to the house of God and not really praying. They weren't encountering God in God's house because they were so caught up in these external rituals. They never entering the depths of their heart in prayer, never entering that chamber. That's where Jesus met God in that temple, and that's why he wanted to stay there. That's why we want to stay in prayer. That's the life of prayer, brothers and sisters. Union with God is opening one's heart, going to that place in the depths of our heart with God. It doesn't require extraordinary works of piety or major sacrifices. Think again of those natives in the South American jungles tended to by St. Laura. They didn't have a grand temple. They didn't have votive offerings or rich jewels and goats and calves to sacrifice. They simply had their hearts, and that was enough. And their lives of the mundane, their hidden lives of simple work that allowed them to enter the depths of their hearts. And that's what we too can achieve. And so we go through our lives in a hidden way as Jesus did for those 30 years, but also as his father, Joseph, did. And let me conclude with him. Joseph was, as we heard last week, truly a man of prayer. He's a man who entered his own heart, entered those hidden chambers, and remained with God. He was the one that taught Jesus where to go when he was lost. He was the one that showed Jesus the comfort of the home of the temple. Joseph, at the end of his life, as we know, he died before Jesus entered into his ministry, his public ministry. Would have been very difficult, obviously, for Joseph to die before his son entered into his glory, before he reached his hour. But this was something else that Joseph surrendered. It would have been sad for Mary and Jesus to see this righteous man pass away. Joseph is the patron saint, among other things, of a happy death. A happy death. Why is that? Why does Joseph have a happy death? It's because he did not cling to life. He had died and his life was hidden with Christ in God, as Paul would say in Colossians 3:3. Joseph had died all the days of his life, and his life was hidden away with Christ in God. Death was no stranger to Joseph because he had lived death every day of his life by abandoning himself to God in the simple, mundane work that he did. Death was his friend, and so when it came, he happily met it. St. Joseph, pray too that we may befriend death and live the hidden life as you and your son did. Amen.